Good evening, I'm Tyler Matheson. When quality comes first, the payoff can be enormous. Tonight you'll meet families who refuse to compromise on their ideas or their methods, who stayed the course and were rewarded with millions of passionate and loyal fans, not to mention millions of dollars. So how do you turn a whiskey few people want into a bourbon millions call for by name? Just ask the Samuels. The family took rough-hewn bourbon and transformed it into smooth, silky Maker's Mark, an icon that helped revive a dying industry.
Bourbon making is in Bill Samuels' blood. 5 generations of his blood, to be precise. His Kentucky family supplied bourbon to settlers, cowboys, and outlaws, including distant relatives like Frank and Jesse James. But the blend back then, and for most of the 20th century, was so harsh that most tossed it back in one quick shot.
My beloved grandmother used to say that that stuff would blow your ears off.
By the 1950s, bourbon drinkers outside of Kentucky were few and far between. Imbibers wanted spirits they could sip and savor, not bourbon. So distilleries across Kentucky, where most bourbon was made, began folding. It was a dying industry. That's when Bill's father, Bill Sr., got inspired. In 1953, he bought a bankrupt distillery and farm in Loretto for $35,000 and set out to make bourbon that people would actually want to drink over and over again.
He wanted to create a bourbon that actually tasted good.
So he burned the old family recipe and cooked up a new one, substituting softer-tasting red winter wheat for traditional rye. This Samuels whiskey was smooth enough to be savored like a fine spirit. He called it Maker's Mark, after the signature made by fine pewter craftsmen. His wife Marjorie, in turn, designed the distinctive bottle, the hand-cut labels, and, like fine cognac makers of the day, came up with the distinctive hand-dipped red wax top. Within a few years, 1959 to be exact, Bill's father was ready to bring his first bottles to market.
But it was not an instant success.
That's the understatement. Dad's definition of making money was being able to meet the payroll.
His father demanded his bourbon crafted slowly, in small batches, even as the few remaining distilleries were churning out 10 times the amount. Maker's Mark barely sold outside the county. So in 1967, Bill's father turned to his son to drum up a few customers.
And he was so proud. We made $8,000 or $9,000 my first year. I felt like I was totally responsible for that till he informed me the only reason we made a profit was because he didn't take a salary.
A few years later, in 1975, Bill Jr. took over as CEO. His father's 4 words of advice: don't screw it up. The whiskey, not the struggling business.
And his idea of success wasn't commercial anyway. It was organoleptic. It was all about the taste.
When was the first profit?
It was about 20 years after we started.
But bourbon's tough working man's reputation and the public's demand for other spirits worked against Maker's Mark. Worse, Bill's father discouraged actually promoting the new smooth bourbon he'd created.
He didn't like marketers. We wouldn't hire an advertising agency. He really was offended by the idea of trying to sell something to somebody they didn't want to buy. And so we sat on the rock and waited for customers to come over the hills.
When they didn't come over the hill or from anywhere else, his father suggested a visitors program.
And I said, why do we want to have a visitor program? We don't have any visitors.
By 1978, Bill had created a visitor center with the help of his sister, Leslie. A few of the curious came to see the new bourbon, but unsold inventory continued to grow. Then, by chance, a newspaper reporter arrived.
This little guy from St. Louis came in with the Wall Street Journal. And he was just curious because a couple of friends of his had introduced him to Makers, and he ended up staying 3 days with my father, was absolutely fascinated.
And he was completely sold on the new Samuels bourbon and the handmade operation. It appeared August 1st, 1980 in the Wall Street Journal on the front page. Within days, there was a flood of interest in Maker's Mark from far beyond Kentucky's borders.
We got my sisters and put them back to work on the phone lines. And Dad and I spent every weekend answering letters from people trying to find a bottle outside Kentucky.
Makers produced just 70,000 cases that year, a fraction of the millions made by distillers like Jack Daniels. Bill wanted to speed up production to match demand, but he worried about tampering with his dad's slow handmade bourbon, so he allocated what whiskey they had instead.
We had distributors and people screaming at us like crazy.
It wasn't a recipe for financial success. Then, just a year after the Wall Street Journal article appeared, family illness and tax issues threatened to put the distillery out of business for good. So in 1981, it was sold to the spirits company Hiram Walker to save it. But Bill and the Samuels family kept complete control of the operation. They made the bourbon their way, slowly, by hand, as they had for 3 decades. And they ignored pressure to rush more whiskey to market before it was ready. Meanwhile, Bill wanted to continue to reach out to customers and market the brand, even if there wasn't enough makers to go around for now.
We're talking tens of thousands of phone calls and tens of thousands. We had boxes and boxes of letters, people hollered. And so I went to him and said, Dad, can't we now talk back to at least the people that are trying to talk to us and do ads that are targeted at those looking for a bottle of our whiskey?
The ads were unlike anything in the industry. They were funny, and they were based on the stories that customers had told them in their letters. The humor struck a chord. Demand surged. Production grew too, but slowly. By 1985, revenues reached $4 million. 5 years later, $8 million. But Bill didn't believe the success would last. So he left Kentucky and went on the road to spread the gospel, bourbon, in the same way he and his father had answered all those letters years before.
Did you go around and retail the product, go to bars and go to stores?
In the beginning, the only way I knew to find out is anybody really talking about what counts to give us a clue as to whether it's sustainable so we know how much whiskey to put away. And that was really the reason I traveled, not so much to be with the distributors, but to just sit in a bar and listen and talk to bartenders. And I would do that mainly in the urban influence centers, San Francisco, L.A., New York, Chicago, Boston, Atlanta.
Back in Loretto, the whiskey continued to be made in small 18-barrel batches. And the bottles still dipped by hand, one at a time.
I'm loving this. You know, you really couldn't do this if you were drinking Maker's Mark at the same time as you were doing this, right?
The Samuels slowly but steadily increased production by at least 10% a year, no more. By 1998, production hit 300,000 cases. That meant $24 million in revenues. Meanwhile, competitors were selling millions of cases. So in 2002, Bill decided to expand the distillery itself, doubling the capacity. But he expanded in the best, most surefire way he knew, by copying the old machinery exactly.
How, if at all, have you tweaked or changed the essential recipe of Maker's Mark?
We haven't touched it. And the process for making it is exactly the same. We make a lot more now.
Every single bottle of Maker's Mark comes out of this place?
Every drop comes from right here.
Sales have increased by at least 10% each year since 2002. Revenues went from $51 million to $58 million to almost $70 million and beyond. In 2010, Maker's Mark reached a milestone, 1 million cases sold. Revenues, more than $130 million. In 2011, Bill turned Makers over to his son, Rob. He's expanding the visitor center and has spread the word overseas from Europe to China.
I asked him, what advice more than any other could he share with me? And he paused, reflected back, and he said, just don't screw it up.
In 2010, for the first time since its founding, Makers introduced a new recipe for a new bourbon. It's only their second product ever. It's called 46. Bourbon enthusiasts are saying it's the best new bourbon since Maker's Mark.
Up next, the